I released Wide Open Spaces in 2016. I had no intention of bringing out a fourth solo album in the near future at that time. I hadn't even thought about it. But I had started recording the odd song here, the odd song there, still with no idea of ever releasing a fourth album or anything like that. But as the songs started mounting up, I thought to myself, this is definitely taking the shape of an album, and maybe I must look at doing the fourth solo album. From 2016 to 2019, there was very little recording activity. I hadn't been writing much material, I hadn't been doing anything. But in 2019, the ideas started to come, and I started recording these songs. I was kind of zoned in, and I was focused on getting this album done. But then, of course, COVID hit.
Yeah.
Lockdown after lockdown.
Yeah.
I found myself juggling between lockdowns and do I allow people in the studio? Will they feel comfortable coming into the studio? So it was a tough thing to get my head around, but we got through it.
It was really, my take is it was due to circumstances actually beyond your control.
Well, yes and no, because the first few years was entirely in my control, but there was just no inspiration to do anything musically at that time.
Tell us about the songs on Big Moving Parts.
There are 8 songs on the album. 3 of them are above 10 minutes in length. The first song, Industrial Evolution, was divided into a part 1 and a part 2. The second song, Big Moving Parts, is divided into 3 movements. The third song was written by Dave Sharp, called Time in Focus. Dave wrote this song back in 2006. It was supposed to be for the 6th Off the Edge album, which never materialized. And I asked him if he minded if I included it on the solo album, and he was happy to do that. There are 2 bluesy songs on the album. Now, I'll be the first to put my hand up and say I don't regard myself as a blues guitar player. And I don't really listen to a lot of blues, but somehow these 2 songs just happened that way. And I suppose my easiest excuse is I just blame it on COVID. COVID makes you do those kind of things. There is also a song that was very close to me growing up. And as a teenager, I learnt it note for note. And that is a song by Santana called Life is a Lady.
Oh.
It came out in the late 70s. And I've always wanted to redo that song. And it's quite a keyboard-orientated song as well, and I spoke to Dave about doing a rework of it. We were going to do our own take on the song.
Okay.
But after we listened to it, it was perfection. There was nothing to redo. My only disappointment was that I felt it was always too short.
Yes, it is a very short track.
So we lengthened it, we added another part to it, but we've tried to keep it as close to the original as possible. Santana's been one of my main influences growing up as a guitar player, and still is. The opening track on the album, Virtual Highway, was also written by Dave. It was released in 2004 on the Off the Edge album, Sight Under Construction. I wanted to rework it, however, and with Dave's approval, we included it on the album.
Tell us about the musicians.
I've always tried to play as many instruments on my solo albums as I can, and on this album I played guitar, bass, a bit of keyboards, but of course I don't consider myself a keyboard player, and I really wanted to get the authentic Hammond organ on a lot of these tracks. So I asked Dave Sharp if he would get involved, and Dave has recently retired and he has a bit more time on his hands, and he was happy to get involved to play on a lot of these tracks. And then of course Dave is not just a keyboard player, he's a very fine bass player as well.
Yes.
And he played bass on quite a few tracks on this album as well. Larry Rose. Larry's been with me since 2013 as the session drummer in my studio, and he's played on 2 of my previous solo albums. So it was a natural choice to get Larry to play on this. And quite honestly, I don't think I could have done it without Larry. Larry and I, we go back many, many years, and we have a way of communicating in the studio. He knows exactly what I want. Obviously, he adds his feel and his input, but we are so much on the same wavelength that it just works. There was one particular track, Industrial Evolution. I hadn't written the song yet, but in June, July, I contracted COVID, and I had heard through the grapevine that a friend of mine, also a guitar player, Mark Beeling, he had contracted COVID at the same time. So I called him, and we found ourselves comparing notes day by day on our progress or lack of progress, on our symptoms, and we both agreed that at the end of our recovery period, we should record a song together. And I said to him, I will write a song, and when it's ready, I'm going to send it to you. Please, I want your input on it. So Mark added a guitar part on it. It came out fantastically well. I'm so happy with it. That's the song that is divided into two parts on the album.
Yeah.
The bass playing on Time in Focus was played by my good friend Mike Doria.
What was the creative process? What was the journey that you followed?
So what I normally do is I would get a guitar riff or a sound or anything like that, and I'd record it in case I forget it. I'll listen to it a few times, and if it seems like it has potential, I'll start adding more instruments. I'll program a drum groove to it. I'll add another part. I'll try this, I'll try that, bring these keyboards in, bring these other guitars in, and slowly it'll develop into a piece of music. At this stage, there's nobody else involved. Once I've completed the demo, I'll send it off to Larry with programmed drums. I program the drums extremely simply because they're just going to be deleted after Larry's recorded his parts. And I'll say to Larry, this is what I'm thinking. I have this idea. I don't want to veer too far away from my idea, but I want your input. Of course, Larry always has a go at me about that because he says, oh, but you know, I have this idea. Am I locked into this groove or am I locked into that? Well, yes, Larry, you are kind of locked into it. But sometimes Larry will come and he will try something else and I'll think, wow, I didn't even think of that. So once that's done, and I've added guitars and we've kind of produced the song, I'll listen to it, and if there really is something else missing, I'll speak to somebody like Dave and say, do you see any scope for Hammond in the song? Do you see any scope for piano or whatever? And then Dave will give me his input. So as much as I'm creating the music, it's the other guys that are also lending their input to the final product. And I like working like that.
Yes.
I hate being confined to something by myself. I've found that the minute you work with other musicians, magic happens.
It's so interesting on how you put the music together, what the whole creative process was with the collaboration and assistance and input from your fellow session musicians. But the recording itself, can you go into a little more detail perhaps?
Larry obviously records his drums at my studio. Dave, having a Hammond organ and a Leslie speaker, we're not going to lug that to my studio. So
No.
He's perfectly set up in his studio, and I send the tracks to him and he adds his parts over there. If there are things that he needs to do here, like bass or whatever, he'll come and record them here. But the whole thing with my productions, I've tried to go for that epicness of the old 70s progressive rock kind of thing. I've always wanted that, and what it normally entails is you end up with 50 to 60 tracks of audio, but it's a very careful juggling act. A lot of the well-known albums from the 70s and the 80s were recorded on 24, 16, even 8 tracks. Now that we've got unlimited tracks, you can go overboard. Your mixes can get bloated and you lose all the definition and the sound just gets completely cluttered. What I've tried to do is, and not just in the production, but in the arrangement of the instruments, nobody overplays. I include myself on that. Larry, he keeps his drum fills as tight and as concise as possible. I keep my playing as tight and concise as I can. I'm not a shredder. I've never been a shredder.
Yeah.
I don't like that kind of music. I find myself getting very bored with it. I like melody. I want people, even though this is an instrumental album, I want people to be able to have a melody in their head once they've listened to it. And what I try and do with that is not just in terms of the melody, but I will try and play that melody on electric guitar, acoustic guitar, nylon string guitar, keyboards, whatever, to try and keep the interest up in the song. Instrumental music's a very difficult genre to try and market these days. And you've got to try and make things as interesting as possible. So the production, if everybody kind of keeps their playing in check and really thinks about the parts they're playing, the final mix and the final production is very easy.
Yes.
It just works. It just seems to mix itself.
Tell us about your amplification.
This is the first album I have recorded from start to finish without using a guitar amp. I have always dabbled in digital modeling. In other words, not going through an amplifier, using digital technology to model the amplifier, to model the speaker cabinet, to model the microphone, and you plug that straight into your workstation and you record without an amp. On Wide Open Spaces, I used modeling, but I used a combination of modeling and mic'd up guitar amps with effects pedals. On this album, I wanted to do things in a different manner. The thing with digital modeling that I didn't like was that although you can get a great guitar sound using it, it wasn't my sound.
Okay.
It was always, I used to play with modeling in the studio and it was lovely, and then we would go and do a live performance somewhere and I'd think, wow, this is actually my sound. My live sound is my sound.
Yes.
What I'm getting in the studio isn't exactly my sound.
Not your signature.
Yes. And I had read about this Kemper device, that you could profile your exact setup. Now, when I say profile, you can take a snapshot of your equipment and almost save it in this unit and recall it at any time and have that sound without your amp, without your pedals, without your speaker cabinet. And I borrowed a Kemper to try out, and it honestly blew me away. I immediately ordered one, and I had it for about 2 weeks, and I decided to profile my own rig.
Yes.
And the results were so accurate that I couldn't tell the difference in the studio between the mic'd up amp or the profiled amp. And once I'd got to that level, that was the end of the amp. I've now recorded this album using the Kemper. I've recorded the bass using the Kemper.
Yes.
It's just been a revelation. The main advantage of using this is you can record a guitar part with a certain setup. Let's say you've mic'd up an amp. You've recorded that guitar part, and 3 weeks later you think, I should have added this part. Now you go back to add that part, you set the amp up, you set the mic up, everything. It doesn't sound the same.
No, it doesn't, does it?
With the Kemper, you recall your profile and it sounds exactly the same as it did 3 weeks ago. So it's been a wonderful experience using this on this album. I'm very happy with the guitar tones. Of course, you can use other profiles that other people have created of different amps. It's just a far wider palette of guitar tone.
And is it tactile? Does it feel like as if you're playing through a guitar amp?
It doesn't feel like you're playing through a guitar amp if you're sitting right next to a blaring guitar amp in the room with you.
Yes.
However, you never record in a studio like that. Well, I never record in a studio like that. You will have the amp in one room, mic'd up, turned up to a decent level, but you'll be sitting in the control room and you'll be hearing the recorded or the mic'd up sound coming through the studio monitors. So if that's the case, yes, it certainly sounds and feels like a mic'd up guitar amp in a studio. For me, that's what it feels like.
Is the album only going to be available on streaming platforms, or can we actually get a disc or a vinyl?
When I produced Wide Open Spaces in 2006, HFX Systems provided sponsorship for the initial CD release. HFX is a high-end audio-visual company based in South Africa. For the new album, I'm happy to say that once again HFX has come on board. Their support has been incredible, and quite honestly, without it, none of this would have happened.
Our involvement with Peter and HFX goes back many, many years. Starting in the late 80s with Wayne, that is an employee with HFX for many years as well. And it became a bit more formal from a casual, friendly relationship around about 2016 with the release of Peter's album Wide Open Spaces. HFX involvement was at the time to be a financial backer to the project in order to get a hard copy CD out in the marketplace. It is for our clients as well, and for HFX, quite important or very important to have a high resolution, high quality, tangible medium available for demo purpose, as well as the satisfaction for a client to purchase such a disc and be an owner of a hard copy disc. In this age of streaming, again, we're now coming to 2021, and Peter is releasing a new album. Again, HFX is involved, and we gladly got involved for this new, very exciting album of his that is about to be launched and released. And we're looking forward to continue our relationship with Peter. We wish him all the best and well for success with this album and this project.
So in answer to the question, it will be available on streaming platforms as well as a limited CD run.